The rapier is the world-famous sword of musketeers, swashbucklers and duelists, even pirates as well. But what was it most often used with? Here we're going to look at the 8 most common things to accompany the rapier. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and in fact we're going to be looking at the 8 objects that accompany a rapier, or indeed a sidesword. Very briefly, for those of you who don't know, a sidesword is essentially the ancestor of the rapier. So this, which is a late medieval sword, comes about in the 15th century, led on to this, the rapier, the true rapier, which came around really in the 16th century. But they are related weapons. They have developed handguards, obviously they get more developed over time, and essentially the only real difference is that a rapier is more thrust-centric than a sidesword. A sidesword is pretty much an even cut-and-thrust sword, and a rapier is more specialised towards the thrust. And in recent videos, which I'll link below, I've been looking at the Spanish rapier specifically compared to the Japanese katana, some of the strengths and weaknesses of each. And in the comments underneath those, and I'll link those videos below, in those it was mentioned the fact that it's unfair that I'm comparing only the rapier versus only the katana, because they were both sometimes used with accompanying weapons, and that is true. So we're going to look at those accompanying weapons here. However, I want to point out that both swords were also used by themselves a lot, but we'll get into that in a second. Now, if you love rapiers, swashbucklers, musketeers and sword fighting, you're going to absolutely love the game On Guard, and Fireplace Games are the kind sponsors of this video. On Guard is the fun swashbuckling game set in a historical environment that's only in fact just launched. It's got gorgeously historically inspired environments and really memorable characters. Your character for the game is Adalia de Volador, a legendary swashbuckler, and much like me, she's a hero of the people. And for all the swordplay fans out there like me, you'll love the fact that while you're fighting the enemies, you can fill up your panache meter, and with that you can unlock special new skills. There are an amazing variety of ways that you can use the environment and the room that you're fighting in, or the area you're fighting in, and in addition there is also an arena mode where you can test out different scenarios. And as you fight through the marketplaces, dungeons and palaces, there's a unique story to unlock and unfold. Developed by a passionate team in France, On Guard has just launched on PC and on Steam right now, link below. On Guard is super accessible, quick and easy to get into. This is an awesome looking game and I am literally leaping into it right now. It's launched today relative to when I'm filming this, so why don't you check out that link below. It's available on Steam right now, On Guard. And thank you to Fireplace Games for telling me about this game and sponsoring this video. So let's get into these 8 accompanying things for the rapier or the sidesword. I'm mostly going to be holding rapiers in this video, but just to remember that the early 16th century sidesword, as featured here, these could apply to that as well. Okay, so the first up is one which isn't an accompanying thing, but which often gets overlooked when talking about accompanying weapons for the rapier, and it's actually one of the most important. It's this. It's your hand, okay? Now, when I made the videos comparing the rapier to the katana, a lot of people said to me, oh, but wouldn't the Spanish rapier be accompanied by some other weapon, such as a dagger or something like that? And the simple fact is that very often rapiers were used by themselves. In certain places at certain times, single rapier, or spada solo as it would have been called in Italy, was quite predominant, and that's for a number of reasons. First of all, a lot of people walking around at that time wearing a sword like this original 17th century Spanish rapier here, without necessarily being bothered to wear something else as well which goes with it. And I won't name all those objects, we're going to look at those in a second. So quite simply, sometimes it's necessity, okay? Sometimes it's because you don't have another thing. But there's another reason as well. That is, the hand is a really, really useful object, especially against predominantly thrusting weapons. Thrusts move in straight lines, and so quite literally there are techniques where you push aside the incoming thrust while delivering your own back. So if I'm standing in guard and a person gives a thrust in here, I have the ability to push aside their thrust while delivering my own back in the same tempo, as it's called, time, in the same single time, okay? So absolutely, if a thrust comes in, it's completely valid, unlike in modern Olympic fencing where this isn't allowed, to parry with your hand and deliver a thrust here. So that's the first thing. Will it cut you? Probably not, because you've got long sleeves. I'm just wearing a t-shirt, but obviously in the 16th, 17th century, you're wearing a long doublet over a shirt. And even if you've got bare hands, it's just not a big problem slapping aside, pushing aside an incoming thrust. That's the first thing. The second thing is the hand is incredibly useful for grabbing, and yes, that was done a lot as well. So whether it's grabbing the hilt, whether it's grabbing the person, whether it's even grabbing their blade, which was done sometimes, this was also done a lot with the left hand, and we see it in all of the fencing treatises of the period. Another big advantage of not having anything in this hand and presenting your weapon side forward is it makes your body a more narrow target. And in fact, even in sections of the treatises teaching you how to use rapiers, when there is another weapon in the other hand, sometimes we see techniques where whatever is in this hand is taken away and thrown back in order to increase the reach on this side, make the body more narrow, bring that shoulder forward. So there are advantages to only presenting this side forward and having this side back, which obviously, if you have something in this hand, can bring it out of reach of being useful against the opponent. And finally, the other very important thing to remember about having a free left hand is you can use it for other things. Using a pistol, grabbing someone, as I've talked about, holding the reins of a horse, climbing up a ladder, holding rigging, all of these sorts of things. So sometimes having a free left hand is super, super useful. And even in some cases, for example against polearms, we see half swording done with rapiers and side swords, so grabbing your own blade to use it like a small polearm. So sometimes this is even done with these weapons as well. So the number 2 most important and most common accompanying weapon for the rapier, I've just switched to a different rapier, this is the Covet and Swept hilt, very, very nice, I'll review this soon, is of course most famously the dagger, okay? And there are many reasons why the dagger is good to use against rapier, but most commonly it's because you can trap and control the opponent's blade. So in a thrust-centric fencing style where the sword spends a lot of its time forwards with the point forwards and a lot of blade in front of the person's body, this offers a really good controlling lever to encounter those thrusts. So if a thrust comes in, exactly like with the hand, a thrust comes in, it gives me the ability to encounter that thrust with one weapon and deliver a thrust in the same tempo, same time, while defending with one and attacking with the other. And sometimes you'll actually defend with the sword and attack with the dagger. And that's one of the great things, fundamental things about the dagger. It can defend, it can attack. It has a big crossguard, so it can trap and control. So unlike some of the other accompanying things, which we're going to see in a minute, one of the great things about the dagger is you can lock up the opponent's blade with these big guards. You usually put your thumb on the inside and steer it like that. So you don't hold it like a sword this way, you hold it sideways with the guard outwards. So it's essentially a bit like a trident at this point. You can catch things in here, you can lock things, you can bind things while you shank the person with your own rapier. Should also mention, daggers come in many, many forms. They don't all look like this. Some of them are smaller, some of them have straight guards. I've got another example here, which you'll be seeing more of in coming weeks and months, because it's one of the new Royal Armouries line that I've been working on. And that is a much bigger and more substantial, with a bigger guard, parrying dagger with a broader blade on it as well. Much heftier. It's pretty much as heavy as a sword, actually. So this, if you're using a rapier, some people say, oh, you can't parry a halberd with a rapier. You can. However, if you make the left-hand dagger substantial enough, you can parry longswords and halberds with these. Okay, so if you're parrying with a big substantial left-hand dagger, then that is, that is a specialised weapon in its own right. It's essentially a parrying object, a device, and it's got the ability to stab as well. And cut in some cases. And also I should mention there are other versions, even more elaborate versions of this, like blade trapping ones with teeth in the blade. There are ones with spring out quillons or guards, and some with a basket hilt as well to protect the entire hand. So there's all different types of left-hand dagger. And if we look through 16th and 17th century treatises, it is absolutely the most common weapon to accompany the side sword or rapier is a left-hand dagger. Now, probably the next most common item to accompany the rapier or side sword, which sometimes gets neglected and forgotten when we're talking about rapiers, is the buckler. Sword and buckler fencing had a continuous lineage going all the way back to the 1100s, all the way through to, well, when did it stop? It was still being done in the 19th century. So if we look at Renaissance, 16th, 17th century treatises with the rapier even, not just with the side sword, with the side sword this was used a lot, more than the dagger, but even with the rapier we still see the buckler is a major accompanying weapon. And what a lot of people don't know is these come in a lot of different forms. This is actually more of a medieval form, but because of course the thrusting style, thrust-centric style of the Renaissance used with rapiers, you require slightly different things from the buckler. So bucklers were evolved which had designs designed to catch and control the opponent's point, because inherently a point will slide off this medieval style of buckler, and while you will be able to defend against it, you won't necessarily be able to control it. So a lot of these bucklers gain ribs, raised kind of almost like railings, hooks, all spikes, all sorts of controlling things on the surface, so that when the blade comes in, it will either get trapped or at least momentarily you can control it to push aside to create an opening to put your own thrust in. In addition to that, there are different sizes of buckler. Some are bigger, some are smaller, and also an entirely specialised and different shape style of buckler known as a targa in Italy. This was not unique to Italy, it was found outside Italy as well, but it was most commonly found in Italy, and hence we use the Italian word, the targa, and that is rectangular and corrugated, okay? And the idea of that is that you can again trap and control the blades more effectively. This first appears in the early 16th century. In fact, with side swords like this, the targa was already around. It's a little bit like a small pavis, and that's probably where it originates, with small hand pavises of the 15th century. But with the targa, as I say, you can trap and control cuts and thrusts, and it gives you angles and points to work on the opponent's blade that you don't necessarily have with a round buckler. So bucklers of various types, various designs, almost certainly the second most popular weapon to accompany either the side sword or the rapier. Now the next weapon which often accompanied the side sword, or indeed the rapier, and certainly for the rapier period, often gets overlooked, and I'm not really sure why, because it's there in quite a lot of treatises, is the shield. Yes, the full-on shield. And I think a lot of people think that shields went out of use in the Renaissance, which is absolute rubbish. They didn't at all. Henry VIII's flagship has a whole load of round shields with guns fitted in the middle, incidentally, gun shields. And the shield was famously used by the Spanish in their wars in places like the Philippines and South America. So absolutely shields were very widely used, but it has to be said, more in war. And I think it's one of the reasons they get overlooked, because people look at civilian dueling with the rapier, and so they're more likely to look at the dagger or the buckler used in the offhand, not so much the shield. But the fact is, shield is there in lots of rapier treatises. Now, this type of shield is known as a rotella. This isn't a particularly big one. They do sometimes get bigger than this. Sometimes they're made of wood, they're not always made of metal. The advantage of metal ones is they could be made pistol proof, which obviously in an age when pistols are now a thing is quite useful, or indeed arrow proof. And so steel shields are generally heavier, but more protective of course. And you have to bear in mind, in war, a lot of people using rapiers would be wearing armour to some degree, not necessarily full plate head to foot, but very often what's called a half armour, or very often something like a brigandine with a burgonet helmet, and a shield, because the shield provides an awful lot of protection, especially if you're fighting the Turks, for example, or fighting in the Philippines, and there are arrows and spears as well as firearms coming your way, then a shield is a very useful thing to have in war. So, quite simply, this type of shield, a round shield, very often used with a rapier, especially in Italy, especially Spain, and especially in colonial areas, and obviously Spain and Portugal at this time, and England were extremely active, shall we say, in their beginning of the colonial period, so South America and Asia, and parts of Africa as well. So the shield of this type was used widely, but also not only these shields, larger types of shields are shown as well, particularly if we look at Marozzo, we see the long shield used, essentially forms of pavis. So large shields were used with rapiers, and of course you can use them exactly like shields have been used for a long time, to simply defend the body, cover the head while you thrust or cut below, against cuts and thrusts, and of course they have a passive use against things which are being thrown or shot at you as well. So a very important weapon of war, and absolutely used alongside rapiers. Now the next weapon used on the left arm is actually very ancient, and I think a lot of people don't realise that, and a lot of people don't think about it when you're talking about weapons, and that is a cloak. That's right, I have my own Schola Gladiatoria cloak here. So this great big massive woolen fabric, how on earth is that useful? Well, essentially in two ways. So this was used in the age of the side sword, and in fact way back Okay, so this wasn't a new thing that came around specifically in the period of the rapier. It was something that had actually been around basically as long as cloaks had existed, and this we can even find it in Roman art. Okay, so we can see it used in Roman art against animals and against humans, being used with the gladius or a knife in the other hand. And essentially it's because it has a few main functions. Firstly, you can protect against cuts with it, and even in a modern self-defense and self-protection situation against someone with a knife, a lot of people advise to take your coat off or whatever you can grab, a jumper or anything around, and wrap it around one arm. Okay, so if you have, it doesn't matter really how long the thing is, you grab a fist load of it here and you wrap it as best you can, oh, there we go, around the arm, and what you now have is a great big padded parrying device. And of course people use this against dogs as well, against attack dogs. So a coat, a top, a hoodie, anything you can pull off and quickly get wrapped around your arm. It is good against biting, it's pretty good against cutting, and it's not so good against thrusting, but it's better than nothing. And what that now gives you is a makeshift shield. And it's very obvious from the ancient world, so Roman, and all the way through to medieval art, that cloaks wrapped around left arms were a very common form of makeshift self-defense. Okay, so as I say, against animals or against blades, this is better than nothing. And of course a lot of people have some type of clothing they can immediately whip off and use on their left arm, and this is exactly what they did, and they continued this into the Rapier Age. So that is one form, is whereby you wrap it completely around the arm, and it's essentially a parrying device. And we see this done against side swords, and I tell you, this is a real sword, and I'm hitting myself fairly hard. Does it hurt a little bit? Yes, it does. I'm careful not to catch it on the bone and things like this, but is it a lot better than just hitting my arm? Hell yeah! Okay, so it works really good as parrying cuts, but against a thrusting weapon, okay, in the age of long pointy blades that are trying to thrust you more often than they're trying to cut you, what we often see now is more this done, whereby it's hanging down, because now the advantage is this long flappy bit at the bottom, which we sometimes see skirts attached to the bottom of shields in the ancient era for use against spears, and it's the same idea. The point is now you've got a parrying device up here and a catching device down here. So if we're fighting Rapier and Dagger against each other and a thrust comes in and I catch it in the folds, either it penetrates and gets caught up or it just gets caught in the fabric of the weapon, that enables me long enough to get my own thrust back into the other person while their weapon is caught up in the folds of my cloak. Moreover, if it gets really caught, it's possible that I might be able to wrap my arm fully around their weapon and capture it, squeezing it into my arm and shank them with abandon. And that's a technical term. And finally, there is a third way that this cloak can be useful. So as well as a parrying device against cuts, which will certainly work very well against rapiers, perhaps less well against heavier weapons, but nevertheless better than nothing, and using the flaps to catch the thrusts. In addition, if I unwind it here, I can throw it into the opponent's face and try and wrap it around their weapon, a bit like how a Roman gladiator retiarius would use their net with their trident. So I can use this thing to get over the person, around the person, over their weapon, bam, while also putting my thrusts in and disguising the fact that I'm thrusting at the same time as doing it. So the humble cloak, which anybody would have access to, is a surprisingly, incredibly versatile offhand weapon that can be used with the rapier, and often was. So the sixth weapon that we often see, or at least sometimes see, accompanying the rapier in the Renaissance is, and some of you may have already guessed this, another rapier. That's right. So pairs of rapiers were used together, pairs of side swords and rapiers were used together in the 16th and 17th century. Some people might call this Florentine style. That's completely made up. It seems to be an SCA term. Ironically, the main sources that we find for two paired source use are actually from Bologna, not Florence. So they'd be Bolognese. But nevertheless, using two swords together was something that was found all over Italy and indeed beyond. Even in medieval art, we sometimes find jugglers, as they were sometimes termed, so essentially performers using a sword in each hand. This was viewed as a highly skilled and somewhat difficult skill to master, and by and large it wasn't done very much for numerous reasons. On the battlefield, a shield is better than another sword because it can block arrows and bullets and other things thrown at you. And in a dueling situation, carrying two swords around is probably quite a pain in the butt compared to carrying one sword and a dagger or a buckler. And many people would argue that most people do better in a fight with a sword and a buckler or a dagger than they do with a sword and another sword. Unless you're really highly trained in it, two swords tend to get in the way of each other because they're about the same length, because they're long weapons. So generally speaking, have a long weapon and a short weapon is more advantageous, because the short weapon, if a person comes beyond the range of this weapon, you have something you can use at close range. If they come beyond the range of this weapon and what you've got is another long weapon, they're now too close for you to be able to dexterously use this. That being said, it was done, it was practiced in the fencing schools, and occasionally it was done in war. It just wasn't very common. So absolutely two sword fencing style, and indeed there were some rapiers made as what's known as a case of rapiers. In fact, you can find a case of swords, a case of falchions is referred to. A case of just means a set, okay? And these are specifically made so that they will fit together as a pair, and they become symmetrical when put together and can be worn in one sheath or scabbard, much like certain Chinese swords in the 19th century. So absolutely occasionally side swords and rapiers were made in a matched pair to be used as a pair, either in the fencing school or for self-defense, and so therefore they could be worn in one scabbard, which again gives credence to the fact that most people probably didn't want to wear two swords, because it would be a real pain to wear two swords. Twice the weight, twice the nuisance, and quite difficult drawing them at the same time as well. Anyway, two swords nevertheless were found in the 16th and 17th centuries, so a pair of swords or a case of rapiers. Number 7 is going to blow your mind. Well, it's going to make it hard to see anyway. Now, this is really an unusual one, and it's actually found in a few rapier treatises and small sword treatises as well. And I don't own one, so I've got the closest thing I've got to it. A lantern! This is a torch, obviously. But the whole point of this is for carrying about at night to see, okay? And if you're walking around the streets of an Italian city or any other city, a French city, whatever, at night, clearly you need a lantern to see. And if that happens to be in your offhand, in your left hand, you can use it as a parrying device, or indeed to blind the opponent momentarily, whoo, blam, while you nail them with a thrust. So absolutely, lantern is a metal object in your left hand. It can become a weapon, an improvised weapon, and it can flash people, so to speak. And therefore, this was exactly how it was used. So there are techniques shown in treatises where you come to fight someone in the street, or they've jumped out of an alleyway and said, "Give us your gold," and you've gone, "No way, you bastard." Pull your sword out, pull your lantern out, and you've gone, flash in their face, bam, thrust, and that's the end of them. Okay, but equally, if they attack you first before you can flash them in the face, you do use the lantern to block with. You can push aside thrusts with it. You could block a cut with it. You could push aside their thrust and nail them with your own thrust. So, lanterns. I told you, number 7 would blow your mind. I hope it has done. Did it? Post in the comments down below. So, flashing people, hitting people, punching people with it, and blocking with it. What an amazing offhand weapon. So here we are at the end. This is the 8th and final accompanying weapon for the rapier. And I think, outside of HEMA and fencing circles, very few people probably know that this is a thing. Can you think of it yet? Post below and then see if you're right. It is a gauntlet. That's right. So clearly, in war, sometimes people used rapiers with some degree of armour, and so they would have had sometimes a gauntlet on, but you can't usually wear a gauntlet with a rapier, although there are certain types of fingered gauntlets that you can, in fact. But this isn't that. We're not talking about a fully armoured man in war. We're talking about a person specifically wearing a type of glove for civilian dueling. They're not wearing any other armour, they're just wearing an armoured glove. Now, this is an earlier 15th century knight's gauntlet that I wear with my full plate harness when I'm doing 15th century reenactment and HEMA armoured combat. This isn't really what we're talking about, but it's the nearest thing I've got to it. So in this period, we're predominantly talking about a full steel gauntlet that has fingers, so individual fingers rather than a mitten like this. And interestingly, on the inside would be mail, aka chainmail. So, What you gain from this is the ability to now to parry cuts with abandon. So if someone swings a cut at your head, you can literally block it with your hand and thrust them through the head. Okay, so you can block with it like a buckler because it's made of steel. But it also gives you the ability to, with abandon, basically, grab the opponent's blade because you've got chainmail on the inside. Now, moreover, there were even disguised versions of these, so don't always think about a literal gauntlet. Although literal gauntlets are described in the Bolognese, for example in Anonimo Bolognese, against a side sword, actually parrying full-on cuts with the thing, so parrying with one and hitting back with the other, using it like a buckler or a shield, essentially, at the same time as parrying and then sometimes turning it into a grab. Okay, so that was done. But also think about if you had what looks like a normal glove but lined with chainmail, and we know this was a real thing. In fact, it's even mentioned in treatises where it says thrust at the opponent's hand, but if they are wearing a chainmail glove, then chop them in the arm instead, or do something else, you know, grab them, do whatever. So they make references to the fact that there were leather gloves, or what looked like normal gloves, that were lined with mail or chainmail for grabbing and parrying, specifically against rapiers, because you have to also remember in the age of rapiers, these aren't powerful cutting swords. You can give a pretty nasty cut, you know, across someone's neck or head or inner arm or thigh, things like this, but they're not cleaving swords in the way that earlier swords were, or things like falchions and things like this, or broadswords. So against, if most of your opponents are going to have rapiers, then just a leather glove, a stout leather glove with mail on it, will probably be enough even to take a cut from a rapier. And certainly enough to grab it and control it. And even if you get slightly bruised or slightly injured, if you think about the danger involved in these fights, the ability to just simply stick your hand in the way and grab, which is an instinctive flinch response anyway, is really, really a big advantage. So we've kind of come full circle, haven't we? Because I started this with going, one of the greatest and most common offhand weapons to use with a rapier is the hand. And what we've now come is full circle, whereby you've augmented the hand, and actually that's even more of a great weapon now, because you've got all of the advantages of not having another weapon in your hand, but you have got fully protected left hand, and indeed you could have a similar one in your right hand to make your hand invulnerable to the opponent's thrusts and cuts as well, which would mean you wouldn't need such an extensive hilt on your rapier, for example. So I would strongly advise you, if you're intending to travel back in time with Bill and Ted or any of your other friends, do invest right now in a pair of fine chainmail lined gloves or gauntlets, because I think they'll be really, really useful when you get back to the 17th century. So hopefully this video has inspired you to become a swashbuckler for yourself. And if you want to be a swashbuckler, you can check out the link down below and check out On Guard. It's a fantastic, fun, light-hearted game with actually really good dueling action in it. It really harks back to the days of those swashbuckling films that I certainly grew up with, be it Zorro or Three Musketeers or all of those pirate movies and things like that. So thanks once again to On Guard and Fireplace Games for sponsoring this video. Check out the link below. I don't think you'll regret it. It's a brand new game just out now, so you'll be right at the front of the queue. And I hope this roller coaster ride through the 8 most popular accompanying weapons for rapiers and earlier side swords has been enjoyable, educational. Please give me a thumbs up because it means a lot to me, and please share the video so that other people can enjoy learning about this topic as you have done. I have been Matt Easton, and I will be again next time as well. I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.